This is Lucerne and not Fuji. Fuji is downstairs. This is a masterclass on PPPs and how you can apply them. It's a practical roadmap to developing public-private partnerships to convert public finance into smart finance. I think so. Well, thank you for being here with us this afternoon. I know it's difficult after having lunch. We're still in a food coma, but I would suggest we make it something interesting and interactive amongst each other. I'd much rather have you participate in a lively discussion, a casual discussion, rather than me standing up here on stage and giving you a lecture. That's not my type of seeing things. First slide, please. I don't have that tweak. So I would like for us to agree on the following thing. Let's have a dynamic conversation. And let's consider I'm merely the session facilitator. So we can learn from each other experiences and take the maximum out of our time together. We have 45 minutes, and I hope we can embark on some rich discussions. Please don't hold back with questions. Feel free to ask at any time. And if we could agree on that, I would be very happy. Everybody okay with that? Thank you. So the agenda I propose now is that we first discuss how public-private partnership in general, what are they? What are they usually helpful to do in terms of infrastructure investments, and what can be derived from that in terms of investing in early stage companies? How can we convert pocket money into smart money? Then I would like to also look at how can we create additional funding schemes. And there's always a very important aspect of governance in any early stage framework. Just like in a complex PPP project, which is long term, you have a lot of complexity which needs to so that everybody can follow. I understand. Okay, it's working again. So this is the agenda I propose. Let's first dive into the public-private collaboration framework. Why do we have PPPs in the first place? Please, I would like to hear your opinion. Don't hold back. Yes?
Because not a single, let's say, institution or entity can be enough to finance the project. So there should be private sector financing, there should be public sector financing.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess hand-in-hand work always matters. Otherwise, and we all know that investments are shrinking. So if the investments are shrinking, I guess it will not be enough. They call it even just for developing countries, you know, like 2.4 trillion. I don't think it's enough, actually. So there is a need to engage the private sector more, I presume.
Any other opinions where we need public-private partnerships? Yes.
So for me, I think the issue is really around balance. Why I say balance is because private sector usually are very focused on return, which is a good thing. Mm-hmm. I think public sector brings a sense of just equity. So they really create a good synergy. So I think when they're both there, increasingly you'll find in the future both need to be aligned towards the same objective, so they're not working at cross purposes. So the synergies are better when they collaborate.
Yeah, very good point. Any other diverse opinions? Is somebody against PPPs? Yes.
Let me ask a question.
Yes.
Can you just, what's the difference between PPP and the BOT model, build, operate, transfer, or is this the same?
Good point. I'll talk about that later. Any other opinion on PPP? Does everybody understand what a PPP is? Okay, that's, yeah, okay, it's a public-private partnership. So increasingly, PPPs have been promoted to finance development projects. But it's also something that now can be used for the entrepreneurship and ecosystem for business angels, for instance. Historically, PPPs stem from allocating funds from the private sector to solve a problem infrastructure gap that cannot be financed through classical public financing. There is no universally agreed definition of what a PPP is.
I think not only,
Yeah.
but it was also used to make some services, public services, more. Thank you. Some public services or some public investments.
Yes.
More profitable.
Mm-hmm.
Or find the kind of way to make it profitable, including
Yes.
through including the private sector in it.
Exactly. So just to give a definition here, technically it's a long-term contractual arrangement where the private sector provides assets and services that have traditionally been provided by governments to build schools, hospitals, prisons, airports, railways, and the list goes on, where there is some form of risk sharing between public and private sector. And obviously your question is very pertinent. What is the difference between a PPP and a BOT scheme? The public-private partnership essentially is the overall denominator under which umbrella these type of contractual arrangements that I have just defined take place. And they can take plenty of different forms. So coming back to our topic now, which I think is the reason why everybody is here, is how can we apply these traditional PPP schemes into helping entrepreneurship be boosted through public-private financing. Next slide, please. I have the power, sorry. Here we go. So is there anything we can learn from these very complex long-term contracts, which often range for 30 years and have a substantial part of maintenance cost that needs to be factored in from the private sector side? And that's always something complicated to calculate in advance, because if you look at the total cost of ownership of an infrastructure, that can vary a lot, especially with technical progress, innovation. I'm just going to say artificial intelligence is completely going to change the way we predict the lifetime of a certain system that is generating energy services, etc. Smart cities are completely changing also metrics in terms of how do we measure the life cycle costs of cities that exist built for the future. And artificial intelligence is also going to be the next thing. How do we manage and massage data? How do we make sense for it so that it actually serves also the beneficiaries, and we have the right ethics in place in order for these public-private partnerships to work the way we want them. So historically, we have had some public-private partnerships that have been extremely successful, and unfortunately a lot of them also that have been criticized because they did not deliver the benefits that were promised. And so I would say the lessons we can learn from these long-term complex contractual relationships in public-private partnerships are ambiguous, and today we need to stand for sustainable development goals. Why? Not because it's en vogue or chic, but because it actually de-risks the projects. It de-risks the projects, and it will help the beneficiaries to get the better public-private partnership infrastructure or public-private partnership in terms of educational partnerships or other forms of cybersecurity PPPs, where both government entities or municipal entities and private sector can, that works better for them. Sorry for this quality. So what are some of the reverse learnings we can apply into the space of this context here? I have tried to shape it that way. Financial viability support roadmap that can help convert the public finance that, say, a municipal entity says, we want to invest in your startup because we believe you can make a tremendous improvement for our community. The pros are the public side is recognizing we need to inject funds to actually improve the overall situation of the local community. However, municipalities or public entities are not best risk aware, and also it's taxpayer money. It's not somebody who has really measured and spending his own money. So this model can make a lot of sense of looking at the entrepreneurs ask, have a group of business angel networks who can evaluate and rightfully offer solution. Ready? Ready? 1, 2, 3. Is it good now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, that's much better. So one of the solutions could be to have business angel networks give seed funding, and obviously that depends on the risk profiles of the respective venture, but it helps to make sure that the investment will be based on a commercially viable prospect. Then, if it is matched by a public entity's grant, guarantee, or a debt, that will help mitigate both the private and public sector risk, and that will help to solve a social objective, say maintain the talent in the region where the startup is evolving, or where the innovation is being generated at the university. And that is very important to ensure that you have a long-term sustained job creation, that you create high-quality jobs, and for example to obtain and reach the United Nations UN 2030 agenda with the Sustainable Development Goals. So these are objectives that can be designed into the process on how you actually achieve a much bigger impact than if it were just one side giving public or private the funds to a company. And that way you're actually able to support with a commercially viable project. Now the PPP dimension in that is that taking these hybrid schemes of both public and private funding, you're able to actually bring that clear societal value and help both public and private to deliver not just promises or these things, but to actually deliver value. And that is the big differentiator that I would like to share with you. So public-private collaboration can solve the financing gap. Very specifically, because in complex relationships like in PPPs, just a second. We have the possibility to look at different angles. We don't see just one of the perspectives of the public or the private sector, but you can have a 360 view on how to have much more impact if both sides join forces to solve a problem. But to do that, they need to work differently. And one of the possibilities is to work in communities of practice across different classes of technology. Say you are in education tech. Well, looking at it from different perspectives will be enriching if you take the ed tech players from the public, private, or philanthropic, and there's a lot of them, to work around the same objective, because these loops of interaction and coordination will help them to improve a culture of knowledge sharing and have a greater impact. That multi-stakeholder impact that also results from that will help, or can be established between all levels of public sector. It can be on the municipal side, it can be on the regional side, it can be on the national level, or even on a transnational level. For instance, right now, there is an initiative called the European Champions Alliance, which aims at helping scale-ups to grow and stay in Europe when they're in hypergrowth mode, because you see that the coordination mechanisms that exist today from the public sector side or from the European Commission are insufficient, or at least don't sufficiently encompass private sector efforts to do precisely that. And so what is happening today is, because of a lack of sufficient exchange and coordination amongst the players, or maybe just a coordination in certain nation states, some tech players prefer to choose a very homogeneous market and leave with all the talent and all the consequences for the brain drain, but also the cash drain and the tax drain. They leave, and you don't know if one day they will come back to the ecosystem that actually created them and that honed them for many years, and now they can't harvest because it's going to be harvested by another ecosystem. So these are, I think, questions that many different countries face today. We have seen an example this morning when we listened to the different countries speaking about their perspectives and about their need to onboard all these initiatives and angel investors and create these things. So instead of everybody planting his beans in his garden, sometimes it's useful to look at the big picture, build these multi-stakeholder alliances so that you're able to have a stronger impact and actually harvest together what you have planted before. Yeah, I think I've said everything on this side. So how can additional finance be channeled through these hybrid schemes? So it's important to have that agenda and make clear objectives in it, so that the objectives that you are aiming in developing or see thrive actually happen when you decide to join forces, both public and private sector. Public funds are available sufficiently. At least I think we can say that for the most relevant markets, but there's a lack of public sector leadership a lot of times, and they lack leadership skills, in particular on public-private partnership, on ESG, so environment, social, and governance skills, because they don't yet encompass these fundamental principles that are necessary to actually deliver value for the beneficiaries. And if it stays something that is completely theoretical, it's not good. You can't just propose value, you have to deliver value at the end. And this is why it's important to factor these things into these funding mechanisms so that you're able to then make a difference. Namely, today it's important to really embrace the concept of the Sustainable Development Goals. Does everybody know what this little SDG wheel stands for?
Yes.
Can you explain it to us, please?
Not the whole thing. No. These are the Sustainable Development Goals as well, the World Economic Forum that were, and this year the World Economic Forum was into these 17 objectives that all the beneficiaries should apply into the companies and will improve the well-being of everybody.
Thank you very much. So I heard you say that this is the SDG framework that is also carried by the World Economic Forum. That's true. Actually, the predecessor were the Millennium Development Goals framework, which were valid until the end of 2015. And since 2016, we have something else, which is called the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's under the broader agenda of the United Nations 2030 agenda. And what that means is that it's a multi-stakeholder effort where universally agreed principles have been defined by public, private, civil society organizations, just about everybody. It's a huge framework with 169 sub-goals under these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And the objective of that is to be able to have an agenda until 2030. Obviously, it's very ambitious and it will probably not be met. But nevertheless, it's, as David Nabarro likes to say, who is the former special advisor of Kofi Annan for the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, he says it's our only plan for the future. And so it's our holy obligation, no matter if we work as a civil society organization, in public sector or private sector, to make sure that in everything that is being done, these SDG frameworks are being replicated or induced and lived by, so that we're able to make sense of them, and so they're worth the paper that actually written on them. And it actually makes a lot of sense, because applying Sustainable Development Goals frameworks to a public-private partnership, that means that you're actually explaining to any party that works with you that you're very serious about achieving these objectives in reality in your project. Some people think it's still theory, but it's on everybody's plate, and it's our obligation to make sure that it's lived by. We need to make sure that even the contractual requirements replicate them, and you can measure them afterwards. I know there are endless discussions of scientists about how can they best be measured. Even the United Nations system of 80 UN organizations has not defined one very clear roadmap on that. Nevertheless, it's no excuse to not apply them, because it's only if we start measuring that we can actually have an impact with them afterwards. So applying them to infrastructure projects, or even also to a startup, makes a lot of sense. Even if they just pick out 2 or 3, that's something realistic. That's something that is achievable, and that is something that can actually make a big difference from a governance standpoint of that startup. So looking at it more now from a meta level, does this have a... No. Sorry. The presentation. Okay, it's back. Do we have a red point on that thing?
Yeah.
Which is the red point? No. I wanted to show you that. So the importance of sustainability and valuism is becoming a driver to all investment that is being done. We've seen that recently during the World Economic Forum in Davos. Some of the biggest investment funds said that we will not invest in companies that don't do the social objectives that we aim to achieve. It's becoming reality. And we see that in any type of investment that is being done today, it's going to be something that will completely change the existing paradigm. People also will want to go to companies that apply these frameworks and that apply human rights in how they do business. It's not something that is completely esoterical anymore. It becomes actual living reality. So it's important to take stock of that, especially if you plan to do projects that are long-term, like in a classical PPP. Obviously here this is the reverse model. We're investing on short-term to have quick results and scale companies so that the investors can either continue investing and growing their fortune or having an exit strategy. But irrespective of that very, say, egocentric view, it's important to create first a pipeline of projects with these environment, social impact, and governance parameters to facilitate connecting investors with that. Because today, there is no global framework for that. And even looking at smaller ecosystems, there is still no good visibility on where do these companies stand with regard to ESG criteria. So this is something that will certainly be developed. I know that the World Business Council on Sustainable Development is working on responsible reporting initiatives. So we'll see a multitude of these things popping up. Then it's also necessary to make sure that there is policy guidance and technical support for these new financing schemes. Has anybody heard about blended finance? Can you? No? So blended finance is a concept where you say that for development finance, you also associate private sector efforts to have a greater impact. So it's very similar. It's another word, but that's what actually blended finance means. And there are actually organizations like Convergence Finance in Canada that looks specifically how to replicate and how to generalize these mechanisms in terms of blended finance solutions. I wouldn't recommend that being applied to a context of venture investments. That is more, to me, a hybrid investment, but just so you're familiar with the term. So we need that policy guidance and technical support to help entrepreneurs move from that pocket, so in other terms, friends and family and fool's money, and move that into the smart money, which helps reach these commitments that philanthropists or business angels want to see today. And I believe that it's very much in the interest of a business angel to have a sustainable investment where he sees that on the long term, his investment will produce positive effects. That's the social element of it, and that's precisely what we're looking into, where we can learn from the PPPs also. So looking at the governance perspective, governance obviously is something that is underlying most of the things we do, but often it's poorly lived or poorly implemented. For these type of early stage investments, it's super important to have robust governance built in from the start. Because I believe that governance has a value of its own. Imagine you do an investment in a company and you have no governance scheme. It will go well as long as the source people, I call them, like not just necessarily the founders, but often it's the founders, but the people who are at the source, who are the drivers of that entrepreneurial project, the pioneers years of it, it will go well as long as they are on board. And the day the investor comes and say, you know what, I disagree, and he replaces him, well, and the company has no governance, you have no security that this structure will continue to perform. You have lost everything the company had if you don't have a solid, robust governance system put in place. And so what I like to recommend early stage ventures is to set up very early in their entrepreneurial venture a so-called MOOP. A MOOP would be done here at the very outset of the project idea. A MOOP stands for here, Memorandum of Understanding and Process. What is that? Has anybody heard about a MOOP? Can you please explain it to me?
Memorandum of Understanding.
Yes? What's in that? What is it for?
How I understand it.
I understand between two companies or public or private sector, when you sign it like a letter of consent that you agree to work on a certain guidelines and to collaborate.
Okay.
That's how I understand memorandum.
So what you mean is a Memorandum of Understanding, MOU. What I mean with Memorandum of Understanding and Process actually goes further. It's an agreement between the people at the source, at the idea of the pioneering project, the founders if you want, who agree on putting down on paper what are their collective ambitions, what are the values they go by, how do they want to collaborate, and how do they not wish to end up collaborating. And defining that up front is something very powerful and will establish the culture of the venue going forward. And that's, for me, the fundamental constitution of any governance that you can then have later in the life cycle of your venture. So it's necessary to take the upfront time to do that.
I had a question.
Yes.
Does it also speak to how they would exit? And sorry, does it speak to the exit strategy?
It should. A good MOOP should define everything you will see in the project life cycle. Obviously, there will be other corollary documents coming down the road, the shareholder agreement, the association, depending on the legal nature of the company. But irrespective of all these legal covenants, it's good as a beginning of having something solid to build on, to have a governance framework like this.
Even if it never goes as you imagine it.
Obviously, we know no entrepreneurial project will go as planned. That we know, and at some point it'll pivot, people will go out, or they will have personal differences and say, I like you, but not in business.
Yeah, but the main idea is to write something at the beginning, because generally you do it when you have big shareholders or something.
Yeah.
This is the main idea, to write something at the beginning.
The earlier you do that, the better, because we know that honeymoon periods only last a certain period of time. So if you do that up front, it will help you for every other thing you do later on. Say when investors come and say, we also want a share of the cake. How large do you want it to be? Oh, and say, and by the way, I also would like to have somebody on your board. And I would like this and that. And so if you haven't established a culture, and that's why it's so important, you know that culture beats strategy. If you haven't established that culture and don't have a means to defend or go by these values afterwards and say, look, but I mean, we like you investors, but these are the things that we have agreed to live by, and we would like you also to respect that, or to at least take that in consideration going forward. And so it will help you for the venture to make sure that it will go where the founding team has decided it wants to go. Things can change, and it's subject to renegotiation in due course, obviously.
Is between the founding member and the smart money provider, or only the founding member?
So depending at what stage the smart money comes in, it can also reflect the smart money's interest. But for the purpose of this graph, I was considering it just between the founders. But it can. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Exactly. So it's very good to do that, except I like calling that from a governance standpoint a MOOP. And then you have articles of association, you have a first shareholder agreement, which will obviously evolve as the funding rounds come. And in parallel to that, it's also important to have, depending on the phase of growth of the project, the maturity level, to have first an advisory board, then a strategic committee, and then a formal board of directors. You will not start with a board of directors, typically. Typically, you're in other considerations, you're much more operational. But at some point, it becomes important to already think about the next step and not just be all the time la tête dans le guidon, how you say in French. Especially once you come, you've crossed the valley of death and you have entered the area after the break-even point where you'll emerge and grow, your hyper-growth with a scale-up, then it becomes interesting to have defined what values you go by from the beginning. So that's why I believe it's so important to apply these things. And so here on the side, I'll read it because it's too small for you. Robust early-stage governance is essential to help scale businesses successfully. Transparency and due process create trust and confidence in the leadership of the source people. Applying the SDG framework and early-stage governance for startups, scale-ups, SME is key to de-risk the investment. So it's in everybody's interest to do that properly because it will make sure that we have a sustainable investment and we don't, jeopardize the investment because there's a lack of good governance. Today, I advise a lot of family companies that at the beginning are very reluctant to open up to governance, to have independent directors sitting on their board. Because they say, they cost money, plus they're not from the family. And who knows? But actually taking the leap of faith and going that way and saying, I'm happy to step back here and allow for transparency in process because it will actually give me a much broader perspective, enriching my experience with other experiences, and will lead to overall better results for the company and its sustainability in the future. You wanted to say something?
No, this is the model that the transformation from family business to a corporate world, which they all struggle
And on a sustainable model, and we did a couple of case studies on how the new generation takes the lead because they're stuck in the family business, but they don't have the actual experience. But how will you have someone independent running it at a corporate, so sustainably the future generation go from bottom up in that company and they will be able to take this lead in the future.
Absolutely. And I can give you another practical example of a company in France that runs veterinary businesses, and the business CEO, who's also a veterinarian, says, I stopped having other veterinarians come into my board. I choose now independent directors because it's easier for me to explain rational business decisions with independent people who don't have a conflict of interest, at least potential conflict of interest. And that's the way to go, because it will do good for the business and for the shareholders obviously too.
Short comment. I believe that this P is becoming more and more important when it comes to the serious agreement. Of course, in MOU, values are always in, and both parties agree on the values, but the process of the P comes when there is a certain concrete project and acts like a kind of contract already. Because what we just recently, we got some funding, not big one, but actually from the serious institution, as you mentioned. So it's
everything inside, even the numbers, everything is. It's called MOU. It's not called MOUP. It's MOU, but it's a very, I would say, you need to dedicate. You need to commit with something. So if you really believe that you will do something, then the P can be there, I guess.
Yeah. It's something fairly new, at least in the ecosystem that I talk to do that. But I've heard some very good feedback from an equity, like a private equity investor who applied that framework that I explained to him the other day. And he said it was so transformative for the founders in the States to have that, and they love it. They embraced it, and they went even further. They defined who should have what role and responsibility, and it helped them to find a mechanism how to all create that psychological bond without it having a legal, value. It's not an enforceable contract, but it's a psychological contract, and that's extremely powerful. It's extremely powerful if you say, in 3 years we aim to be among the 75% best rated startups in our niche. That will create something amongst the people who are on board in that venture. So, moving to the next slide, I have brought to you a checklist that I believe are important. They were designed for PPPs, but are certainly some of the things you can transpose to the venture world. So it's important to learn the do's and don'ts in people first PPPs. What I mean with people first is applying the SDG framework to public-private partnership. And get things right from the start. Policy matters need to be taken seriously by business angels and their public sector counterparts, so that projects have the right strategic aim and development objective. So put the chances on your side and take the upfront time to make sure that what you want to achieve together, both public and private, is actually also going to happen. Sorry. Institutionally, it's also important to have a dedicated PPP coordination unit. So if you work with municipalities, encourage them to have something like a PPP coordination unit. That's something that will help to coordinate the efforts that are being done on a local scale to help develop and, to cherish or to pet the ecosystem so that it can achieve the right results overall. Say your region is particularly strong in automotive technology. Well, why not concentrate on these type of things and help the emerging technologies and innovations from the automotive sector also be incubated or accelerated through these PPP coordination units on a local scale. And that can be very easily then supported by automotive manufacturers or say airplane industry, depending completely on the type of industry that you have in your region. Some regions will be very strong in agrotech, others in medtech. I can see in Switzerland alone, where I currently am based, I can see at least 3 regions that brand themselves now as MedTech Valley. So only the imagination of people is the limit to how they brand themselves, but actually having a coordination like that is super helpful. And we can see a lot of examples of these coordination units, may not be called PPP coordination unit, but they do that. If they do investment promotion, they can do that on the global scale, like World Association of Investment Promotion Agencies, or the FOMOSA people who look at how can we help develop the Free Trade Association network and derive benefits from that. So PPPs also require high quality training, because a lot of times these skills of coordinating and collaborating with other sectors are more present in the private sector, with salespeople or people who do community management. not necessarily in the public administration, so we need to upskill them and help them to be there when it's useful. Then we also need to make sure that there are open competitive tenders to ensure that procurement is done in a sustainable way. That's instrumental to make sure that they respond to the needs of the beneficiaries. And the beneficiaries are you, I, all the people who want to improve lives. But that will not happen unless we make sure that we have these open competitive tenders. It's a scandal to see that large infrastructure contracts a lot of times only get one offer. One single offer. Sometimes it'll be a consortia, you're right, but a lot of times what that means is you have a lack of competition. And not having competition is a disaster because it kills off innovation, it doesn't create opportunities that we would have if we could actually choose from different offers. And you can't do arbitration or arbitrage between different players and say, this procurement solution I like, the design of that project I'm not so sure, but so you can't compare. And if you can't compare, it means you have a less interesting negotiation life. Because you're just negotiating with one person, you have to accept or do or die. And that's not something that is positive. So it's important to have open competitive tenders and make sure that these tenders are not too vast, because sometimes the sheer size of them eliminates a lot of potential bidders, and that's also a problem. What about all the projects, and that's another lesson we can learn from the PPP world, what about all the lessons we learned from One Road, One Belt? The Belt and Road Initiative is probably the generation's largest infrastructure opportunity that there is. But what happens a lot of time is that SMEs or certain countries are left out. And we can't afford to leave them out because it leads to huge injustices, especially if it's transnational projects like this that connect different parts of the world. We need to make sure that we apply the SDG and the human rights framework to these contracts. I personally am not comfortable with having that dictated by one ideology. I think it needs a multipolar perspective on how applying these things. I don't say Belt and Road is negative. To the contrary, I think it's a great opportunity. But we need to accompany it with the right type of public-private partnership, the People First PPPs, and the World Association of PPP Units is trying to do precisely that, embarking in a multi-stakeholder effort to help our Chinese friends to realize that dream of having the Silk Road, it's a 2.0. So multilateral development banks obviously also play an important role in that multi-stakeholder environment and need to start working with business angels, with VCs, corporate ventures, and other non-state actors, as for instance, churches. Churches have extremely powerful public-private partnerships where we don't necessarily see them, or where states often don't go anymore because they've abandoned that part of the region. And churches, we need to start working with them and look at, okay, you're doing something really useful here. It's about these type of things, so there's plenty of opportunities and blind spots that we don't tap into today with our financing mechanisms that we could take advantage to actually improve the situation, despite very different legal and institutional frameworks. Then also environmental sustainability should be at the core of the PPP projects. And as we've seen, we need solid governance to deliver these cross-cutting projects at the point of data interference, and also make sure that that the privacy of data is being respected, especially if we work in an international governance. So let me finish by speaking a little bit about the World Association of PPP Units, which we have created a couple of months ago. I have a brochure here for you. If you're interested, you can pass it on, please. WAP is organized in communities of practices. Some of them look into how can we do sustainable PPP projects, people first oriented. We have working groups that work on PPPs in health, others that will look at what are the complexities around the One Road, One Belt. And so we're a global network of PPP experts, and we maintain relations with all sorts of international organizations in that space. Obviously, we have members from the private sector and others from the public sector. Most of them are PPP professionals, because in one's career, you will likely change from public to private. It's rare nowadays that somebody does his career completely in one sector, so it's important to also replicate and be there as a network for these PPP professionals. What we do is knowledge sharing. We do webinars. There will be one on the 24th with APMG, which is a training provider, and it will be on the viability of the financing of PPPs. We also curate a weekly newspaper called the PPP Times, where we select the 10 PPP articles every week, and we reserve that to our members. And then we are planning to start building a capacity building platform so that we can actually go out, help civil servants, enhance their capacity and knowledge about doing better PPPs, so that the public tenders go better, and that also the public servants get to meet private sector people up front to understand what are each other's needs, so that the tenders can be designed in a more efficient way in the future. You can follow us on social media, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and with the PPP Times. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention, and this concludes our masterclass for today. Thank you.